The situation we're in is, well, it's quite difficult to describe. We're facing the greatest challenge, the greatest crisis that humanity has ever confronted, which is the possible collapse of our life support systems. Now, we've faced many crises in the past, including some horrendous ones, almost unimaginable for people living, as I do, in comfortable circumstances in the rich nations. War, famine, genocide. And they have exerted impacts on human beings which, well, we just can't picture ourselves in that position because they've been so horrendous. But humanity as a whole has come back from those. We have rebuilt. We have come back to situations which in some countries at least are tolerable and often quite good for the majority. But what we're facing now is on a different scale altogether. And if this collapse does happen, there's no coming back from it. Because, and this is fundamental, what we're dealing with here are complex systems. The atmosphere is a complex system. The oceans are a complex system. The soil is a complex system. The biosphere, all the life on Earth, is a complex system. And complex systems have a series of characteristics which are completely unlike the characteristics of simple systems. So if you think of a simple system as being, for instance, a wash basin, and you have a tap where the water comes in and a plug hole where the water goes out, and if you want to adjust the level of the wash basin, you can turn the tap one way or the other and gradually bring down that water level if that's what you want to do. But a complex system doesn't have simple inputs and simple outputs and respond in a simple linear and progressive way like the water level in your wash basin. What it tends to do is to absorb stress up to a certain point. And it has its own spontaneous dynamics which create equilibrium. So, for instance, the global climate system will manage to take quite a battering. It'll absorb the impacts of our greenhouse gases up to a certain point, and it stabilizes itself through these spontaneous emergent characteristics that all complex systems have, but only up to a point. Because beyond a certain point, the system starts breaking down, and those spontaneous self-organizational characteristics it has, instead of damping down the state of the system and maintaining equilibrium, exacerbates the fluctuations, exacerbates the stresses that it's subject to. And it goes through wilder and wilder fluctuations until it suddenly hits a tipping point. And if it passes that tipping point, that critical threshold, it collapses into a completely new state. In fact, a new equilibrium state, because it'll still be a complex system, it'll still be a self-organized system, but it'll self-organize in a completely different situation. In other words, it undergoes something that scientists call hysteresis. And what hysteresis means is that it basically gets stuck in the new state. It takes far less energy to tip a complex system past its critical threshold than it takes to push it back into the situation it was in before it reached that tipping point. It's a bit like a boulder on top of the hill which is wedged into place by a pebble. Doesn't take a lot to take that pebble out, but once the boulder has rolled down the hill, rolling it back up the hill takes a massive amount of effort and energy. And basically, if we allow the world's complex systems to tip, and to tip into a state for which we as humans, and indeed most of the rest of life on Earth, have not evolved to survive in, it will effectively be impossible to tip it back. Once that collapse has happened, that's it. That's curtains. And broadly speaking, the world will transition from a habitable state to an uninhabitable state. Now, complex systems have common characteristics. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at the global financial system, or a shipping insurance network, or an Antarctic ice shelf, all of which are complex systems and have the very similar self-organizing dynamics and adaptive and emergent characteristics, maintaining equilibrium. One of the things we know about them is that as they approach a tipping point, their outputs begin to flicker. We see wilder and wilder fluctuations. That's what was happening in 2008 when the global financial system very nearly collapsed and had to be rescued with trillions of dollars before it flipped past its tipping point and became virtually impossible to rescue. It was fluctuating more and more wildly. We saw crazier and crazier things happening on the financial markets. We saw banks beginning to collapse. It was getting very close to its general global tipping point. And what are we seeing today with climate? We look at what's happened in 2021. The heat domes over North America, the massive droughts and fires there, the fires across Siberia, around the Mediterranean, the huge floods in West Africa, in China, in Northern Europe. This looks to me very much like a great global flickering that's going on. In other words, this is a sort of mayday signal that the planet is sending us. It's saying we're very close to a global tipping point. The climate could tip, the biosphere could tip, the soils could tip, because all these systems are interlocked. We put them into categories to make it easier to understand. We say, oh, this is climate, this is ecology, this is soil, this is ocean. But those are just things that we create, artifacts, so that our brains can understand them. These systems are all intimately connected in reality. So the global circulatory system, which transfers heat from the tropics towards the poles, that is absolutely interlinked with the behaviour of the oceans. It's also interlinked with what are called the rivers in the sky created by the Amazon and the Cerrado ecosystems in Brazil, which help to power this circulatory system. These are great streams of wet air which are produced by the trees and the vegetation in those ecosystems. It's interlinked with the soils and the extent to which they're absorbing carbon or releasing carbon. And it's interlinked above all with the biosphere, with the plankton in the sea, with the trees on the land, with the animals, with the fungi, with the bacteria. All these things are meshed together. And if one part of the system, this complex system of complex systems, collapses, it's likely to trigger a cascade of collapse, that one part brings down the other parts and it goes bang, 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 like dominoes. And it's happened before. I mean, this wouldn't be unprecedented. This is what happened at the end of the Permian period 251 million years ago, triggered by massive outpourings of carbon dioxide from the volcanoes in the Siberian traps, which then triggered a whole cascading series of collapses. And we ended up with a world in which roughly 90% of species were extinct, including almost all large-bodied animals. So this is something just completely off the scale. Anything that human beings have experienced before. I mean, an uninhabitable planet. It's something for which we have no historical precedents. We have no psychological equipment which allows us to process this, to deal with it. And it seems, unfortunately, often to make sensible decisions in how we should respond to this imminent crisis. But what it also tells us is this, that because we're dealing with complex systems, our simple model isn't going to work in helping us to prevent this unimaginable crisis from happening. I mean, what governments are basically doing is turning down the tap in the wash basin. They say, well, we'll have an incremental reduction in greenhouse gases this year and another one next year and another one next year, and slowly we'll turn down that tap and the water level will drop. So it's a category error of the greatest kind. They're dealing with complex systems as if they were simple ones. The only strategy which gives us a high chance of preventing this systemic environmental collapse that I'm talking about is sudden and drastic action. Because when you're dealing with a system that's not linear, that doesn't behave in linear, progressive ways, but suddenly shifts from one state to another, the only safe way of preventing that system from shifting is to make a sudden shift in a different system, which is the global economic system, from one state to another. A shift from a system which is producing massive greenhouse gases, but also a whole suite of other environmental effects, to one that isn't. It can be done. We've had some profound historic shifts in the past, and in another programme I can discuss those. But it's not going to happen without global movements on a scale many times greater than those we've seen so far, tens, hundreds of times bigger, even than the very inspiring movements such as Fridays for Future, Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion, Green New Deal Rising. They have to be much, much bigger if we're going to make it impossible for governments to avoid making those hard decisions. So why aren't we mobilising? Why aren't we getting together on the requisite scale to demand that sudden and drastic shift? Well, part of the problem, I think, is that there's a myth about humanity, a myth that withstands almost all evidence, and that is that we put our survival first at all times. And it's plain to me that actually that's not what we do. When we're faced with a chronic threat such as climate breakdown or environmental breakdown, we seem to put almost everything else first. Other species don't do that. If they're faced with a chronic threat such as winter, for instance, they might migrate or hibernate. Their survival comes first. But we behave in strange ways. Our brains, which are themselves a complex system, almost play tricks on us. So, for instance, some people, when faced with this threat, appear to subconsciously absorb it and double down on their destructive activities, flying off to Oblivia on the long-haul jet flight, swapping their ordinary car for an SUV, pretending it's not happening at all, actively denying climate science. I mean, if we were a species which put its survival first, this stuff would be on our minds all the time. We would be talking about almost nothing else. We would be demanding action on a scale commensurate with this enormous crisis that we face. But even when we attend to it, we do so in ways which are almost comically petty. Changing our cotton buds, literally. That is a sort of major campaign, whereas looking at the system as a whole is on almost no one's radar. I mean, I doubt 1% of people have currently grasped what we're actually facing, and yet people will talk about their coffee cups and their plastic bags. They'll talk about what I call micro-consumerist bollocks, rather than looking at the systemic problems we face and the systemic threats which our economic system and political system are currently causing. And the fundamental issue here is that, yes, we do have a survival instinct, but in many circumstances it's not the instinct that comes to the fore. It's a different instinct that we prioritise, which seems to trump the survival instinct, and that is the obedience instinct. Our instinct to obey often seems more powerful than our instinct to survive. And this was an observation made in what potentially, arguably, is the greatest Russian novel ever, which is a huge claim to make, from a nation which has produced Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and many other fantastic authors. But I would put right at the top of the list Life and Fate by Vassily Grossman. And this is a man who lived through the situations that he described. He was a Jewish man living in the Soviet Union, threatened by all the horrors of the Soviet Union, but also by the anti-Semitism there, also, of course, by Nazi invasion and the very particular threats which Jewish people faced from that. And he saw at first hand the horrors around which he built this extraordinary novel. And he said that one of the striking things that we've discovered about ourselves under these totalitarian systems, both Soviet and Nazi, is people's preparedness to obey. Even when the threat is imminent and acute, they obey. And while being very careful to point out that this is not in any way to blame the victims for the atrocities carried out against them, he said that people would queue up all day and all night to be executed. They would wait in line. They would hold their place in the line. They would argue about where they were in the queue, waiting to be executed. And he said that what those totalitarian dictatorships discovered was an almost infinite capacity for obedience in people. And he thought that that was a result of totalitarianism, but I think it's everywhere. I think we are all too ready to obey in almost all circumstances. And our focus on the trivia, by comparison to these enormous, existential, unprecedented threats that we should be talking about all the time, I see that as a form of obedience. When we listen to the radio on days of climate disaster, and I've tried this exercise, you should try it yourself. Wait till there's a day of real climate disaster where there's a massive heat dome, wildfires, floods, whatever, and just skip between channels on the radio and listen to what they're talking about. What we hear is an almost frantic determination to discuss anything except what is important. So last time I tried this, the first thing I came across was a long discussion about whether you should sit down or stand up while pulling on your socks. I mean, the world was literally on fire. Large portions of the world were on fire, and the discussion was, how should we best pull on our socks? Switch to another channel. They were talking about charcuterie boards for dogs. I kid you not, I'm not making this up. Charcuterie boards for dogs, which apparently is a thing, where you have some sort of wooden board with lots of different things for a dog to eat on, and they were discussing that. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone's saying to themselves, oh my God, the world's on fire, quick, let's talk about charcuterie boards for dogs. It's a subconscious reflex, which I think tells us far more about ourselves than our conscious actions do. And we are completely immersed in this trivia. Even the so-called serious channels, the serious radio and TV programs on the BBC and elsewhere, what passes for news there, particularly political journalism, is really profoundly trivial by comparison to what's going on. It's court gossip, who's in, who's out, who said what to whom. You know, the real issues, the fundamental things which govern politics now, like the influence of money, you know, people paying for political parties, buying policy effectively, either money that's out in the open or dark money, which we're not seeing. That is very seldom on the journalist's agenda. It very seldom features in any news programme, even though it's so fundamental. The transfer of power away from democratic spheres into places which people can't affect, again, scarcely features. The growing and immense power of plutocrats and oligarchs effectively trumping democracy, again, scarcely features. But above all, this huge looming threat of systemic environmental collapse, which makes a nonsense of all those obsessions. Even on the so-called serious programmes, we scarcely hear a word about it, except when there's a climate summit going on, and then it's more of who said what to whom, and oh, what's Boris Johnson doing? Oh, what's Joe Biden doing? Rather than really getting to the heart of this enormous existential crisis. And so it's all of this I see as an obedience reflex, obedience on the part of the media, who, unfortunately, the great majority of people in my profession, journalism, are far too ready to obey. But also, I think, obedience on the part of listeners who almost want to immerse themselves in this trivia so as not to think about these massively important and dangerous things that we should be thinking about. Now, look, I'm not against bants. I'm not saying we should discuss only these existential crises. What I'm against is nothing but bants, is a focus on trivia and trivia alone. This pernicious frippery, frivolity, which seems now to govern our culture, where we almost have our heads ducked into this vat of inane gossip, of banter, so that we don't listen to the voices desperately trying to alert us to the scale of the catastrophe that we face if we don't take sudden and drastic action. And this aligns very closely with the corporate agenda. And in fact, corporations have gone to some lengths to ensure that we focus on trivia. So, for example, a classic case of this was something that started in the 1950s with a campaign called Keep America Beautiful, where the campaign's effort was to focus our attention on litter as the primary environmental issue. Now, I hate litter. I hate seeing litter. I don't want there to be litter around. I applaud those who pick up litter. But it is not the primary environmental issue. It's the issue the corporations wanted us to talk about. Because behind Keep America Beautiful, believe it or not, were the packaging manufacturers who were causing the litter, who were basically covering the world with a tsunami of plastic. I mean, this is a real and important issue. But the issue is a systemic one. It's not just caused by a few litter louts or litter bugs. And in fact, litter bugs was a term that these corporations invented through their Keep America Beautiful campaign. It was caused by them. And they wanted to get away with it. They wanted to stop deposit schemes for bottles so that the bottles could be reused. They were trying to prevent states from imposing those schemes. They wanted everyone to be using throwaway packaging. And of course, some of that packaging would leak out and float around in the natural world in the form of litter. And so their effort was to refocus our attention onto the issue of litter and onto the issue of us, what we were doing, rather than what they were doing. And it was highly effective. In fact, their so-called Crying Indian advert was the most popular advert ever shown in US cinemas. And everyone thought it was a genuine environmental advert put out by an environmental campaign called Keep America Beautiful. But it was one of the most cynical corporate campaigns in history. And there have been many more. The way that Ogilvy and Mather, the advertising agency working for BP, more or less invented this concept of the personal carbon footprint, which is quite a useful concept. I mean, I use it myself from time to time, but their effort was not to help us to engage with these issues. It was to turn our attention away from what BP and the other oil companies were doing and onto our own individual impact. So we talk about my footprint and your footprint rather than BP's massive corporate, world-spanning, world-crushing footprint. And that's been the thrust of this great shift over the past 50 years, which has been a shift from collective to individual action. It's been a shift which tells us we're no longer citizens, we are consumers. And the way we can be effective is by changing the things we consume and by changing the way we consume. But if there's one thing that human history tells us, it's that we're effective together and we're ineffective alone. If we try to change the world through our own buying and selling decisions, we'll make almost no difference at all. It'll be entirely marginal. The only way to create effective change is to combine with other people and combine and campaign as citizens. That's what makes change. Not this micro-consumerist bollocks which the corporations want us to focus on. But somehow we've been herded down that path. Our instinct for obedience has kicked in, and we've done what the corporations want. Instead of behaving democratically as citizens, we've behaved plutocratically as consumers. We've accepted the idea of the market as being the forum within which we should act, rather than politics, democracy being the crucial forum. And it's another classic case, I think, of the way in which, without even recognising that we obey, we are obeying. So what would happen if we cut through the trivia, if we pushed aside the micro-consumerist bollocks and actually looked at the systemic issues driving us towards disaster? What would we see? Well, the first thing we would see is growth, and it should terrify the living daylights out of us. Growth, isn't that meant to be a good thing? Economic growth, every government is striving for it. In fact, they stand or fall according to whether they're able to deliver growth. The system is deemed to fail if it's not delivering growth. Well, take the ambitions, for instance, of the World Bank and the IMF, which say, well, we're not asking for a lot of growth, just 3% a year. 3% global growth a year. That's reasonable, isn't it? 3% a year means that global economic activity doubles every 24 years. So, for instance, by 2045, we have twice as much global economic activity as we have today. By 2069, twice again. And then twice again, and then twice again. It doubles and it doubles and it doubles. But already the planet is straining towards collapse as a result of existing levels of economic activity. We want to double that. We want to double it again. I don't know how many of you have seen, and realise that probably you have to have kids to have seen it, but Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, where Harry and his friends go into the Lestrange vault in Gringotts Bank to try to find this thing, I think it's called a Horcrux, amid the treasure in the bank. But the treasure has a curse put on it called the Gemino curse, which means that if you touch it, it doubles. And then it doubles again, and then it doubles again. And the weight of the treasure then threatens to crush Harry and his friends to death. That's what we're looking at. Economic growth is the Gemino curse, where the wealth doubles, and it doubles again, and it doubles again, and it crushes the life out of us. That's what it does. We cannot live with perpetual economic growth on a finite planet. It busts through the planetary boundaries. It pushes us towards those tipping points. It pushes us past the critical thresholds. It will cause systemic environmental collapse if we obey the demand that this growth continues. But underlying the growth is something even bigger, something which we're scarcely permitted to discuss in polite society. People cover their ears because it's virtually blasphemous to name this thing, which is capitalism. Now, if you were to grab someone in the street and just say, "What is capitalism?" to them, this system which defines our lives, which limits our lives, which is all around us, the air we breathe, is capitalism. If you say, "What is capitalism?" I bet that the great majority of people would struggle to define it. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? And then mumble something about, well, hard work and enterprise, buying and selling and stuff. But when you look at how the huge fortunes under this system we call capitalism have been made, it's not through hard work and enterprise and buying and selling. It's through grabbing. It's through looting the wealth of other nations, exploiting the labour of other people, through monopoly, through rent seeking, and then through inheritance. In fact, some of the richest people on earth have scarcely done a day's work, and yet they've been enriched to that extent through capitalism. And capitalism, in ecological terms, is effectively a pyramid scheme, because not only is this looting taking place across space, where the rich nations loot the poor nations, the rich people loot the land, labour, resources of the poorer people, but it also takes place across time. The apparent health of the system today depends to a large extent on looting resources from future generations. But capitalism itself is a means to an end, and that is, the end is enriching those who benefit from it, and enriching them to an extraordinary, unequal extent. And capitalism is the means by which the wealthy become even wealthier. And so really at the heart of the problem is this issue of wealth. In fact, there's very good evidence showing that it doesn't really matter what your attitudes are. Your ecological impact and your climate impact are a function of how much money you have. If you have that money, you will spend it, and however you choose to consume, the very weight of your consumption outweighs whatever individual decisions you might make. So while in order to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating, we should each globally be consuming no more than 2 tons of carbon a year, the top 1% burn 70 tons of carbon a year. Billionaires, thousands of tons. Roman Abramovich, for example, over 30,000 tons a year, largely from running his gigantic yacht. Now, it doesn't matter what kind of fuel he puts in that yacht. If it's biofuel, it causes all sorts of other disasters because it requires vast areas of land to be used to produce the plants which are producing that biofuel. And either people go hungry or ecosystems get destroyed to do that. It's the sheer weight of consumption that counts. But of course, very wealthy people whose political power matches their economic power are keen that we don't see it in that way. They're keen that we stick with our micro-consumerist bollocks and that we remain immersed in the trivia that surrounds us. And it seems to me that if we are to engineer the drastic and sudden and systemic change that we require, we must start by addressing this issue of wealth. Even a carbon tax, I feel, is a form of micro-consumerist bollocks because it addresses just one part of the problem. And it tends to hit the poor just as hard as it hits the rich, if not harder. What we really need are wealth taxes, massive wealth taxes, to make it just unattractive to try to be a millionaire or a billionaire, to ensure that the money can be redeployed into places where it can be more usefully spent, to break down the massive inequality, which is one of the things that drives us towards obedience. And we can use that money to create new systems such as something I call private sufficiency and public luxury, rather than this system of massive accumulation and the pursuit of private luxury, which the planet simply can't afford. But for that to happen, we need mass movements. We need movements, as I say, tens or hundreds of times bigger than they are today. We need movements of people who refuse to consent to this planet-eating system. We need movements like Fridays for Future, like the Sunrise Movement, like Green New Deal Rising, like Extinction Rebellion, but many, many times bigger. Movements that involve you. Yes, all of you. I mean, you don't have to be out on the streets protesting because those movements need the whole skill set. They need accountants, they need administrators, they need people who can sew stuff, they need climbers, they need every kind of profession and activity you could possibly imagine to be effective, because a good movement is an ecosystem. And what we need is to recognise the fundamental issue that strikes at the heart of the problem of systemic environmental collapse. And this issue is our survival depends on disobedience. Thank you.